I want to make Heston Blumenthal's ultimate roast beef dinner. What would arguably Britain's greatest living chef have for his roast dinner on a Sunday? It would have to be roast beef. I'm Gary from Big Spud, and as a self-professed Heston Blumenthal superfan, I'm going to be going through his vast cookbook collection and picking out some of his best recipes to put together into his ultimate roast beef dinner. And where does it all begin? Of course, with the beef. Here I've got about a 700 gram rump joint. You could use any beef joint you want for this technique we're about to do. Heston favours a very slow, low roasting technique, which I'll go over in just a second. But before that, let's dry brine. The night before, dust liberally with salt and place on a rack over a baking tray. Really work a lot of salt all over that joint. We're not going to season it past this, so it's just going to sit on the surface. But we're going to pop it in the fridge overnight. Dry brining is a great technique for any meats. The next day, set your oven pretty low, 60 or 70 degrees. Some ovens don't go any lower than 100 degrees C. That's this in Fahrenheit. But set it pretty low. Take a heavy frying pan and get a little oil in it and begin to brown the meat on all sides over a very high heat. Make sure you do the tops and bottoms as well as the fatty bit. I'm just going to create a small trivet so the base of the baking tray doesn't transfer extra heat and overcook the bottom of the beef. I'm using a bit of celery here, but it could be a carrot, some pieces of onion, anything like that. Even a piece of tin foil would do. I'm using a probe thermometer here, the Ninja Pro Chef, which will give me readings direct to my phone. There are loads of models of this type about, but essentially I'm going to cook it to the sort of high 50s, 56, 57 degrees C. That'll give us a lovely medium rare finish on this beef. This can take anywhere from 3 to 6 hours depending on how big your piece of meat is and exactly what mood you're ovening and how quickly it stabilises the temperature. I took that technique from Heston Blumenthal at home, where he details slow roasting of beef, and that's the recipe we're following today. So while the beef cooks, why did I choose to do roast beef for Heston's ultimate beef dinner? Well, he actually told us in this book, My Last Supper, The Next Course, by Melanie Dunea. This is a gorgeously shot book full of 50 chefs and what they would have for their final meal, including Marco Pierre White, Grant Schatz, Massimo Bottura, Wolfgang Puck, and many, many, many others. When I saw this book, I thought, I'll do Marco Pierre White's final meal. So I imported it from America, and after it arrived, I turned to the Marco Pierre White page, and he doesn't actually list a final meal. Not very helpful. But Heston himself does list a Sunday roast as his last meal on earth. It would be roast beef with Yorkshire pudding, carrots confit with caraway salt, runner beans with shallots, braised radishes and chopped parsley, roast potatoes, absolutely, red wine sauce made with the roasting juices of the beef, red wine, and little pearls of rendered beef fat, slices of bone marrow with parsley breadcrumbs, gratinade on the slice. So our beef's ready now. We're going to take that out and just cover that with foil and allow that to rest for 10 to 20 minutes. So we can do the roast potatoes. Helpfully, a recipe I've made loads of times, but he's got his own version of that roast potato recipe in this very book. There's no particular trick to it. You take large floury potatoes, like Maris Pipers, quarter them and boil them in salted water, simmering away until pretty tender, dangerously tender, falling apart. Meanwhile, in a hot oven, about 200 C, you're going to add a baking tray and very generously fill it with oil. Heston only specifies olive oil. Of course, you could use other fats as you see fit. The potatoes are going to take about an hour, so we're going to pop those into the fat, pop them in the oven and leave them undisturbed for a good 20 minutes so the bottom crust starts to develop. They shouldn't stick at that point and you can turn them over. After about 30 minutes in the oven, I'm going to add some aromatics to the baking tray. Some rosemary, thyme, garlic, plenty of salt and pepper. We can check the seasoning towards the end. Every 20 minutes or so, you're going to go in there and turn the potatoes over so they're basting on all sides and getting an even colouring. So a Yorkshire batter. Again, a few hours before, we'll add egg and flour and then adding enough milk to form a gloopy batter. You want something that's like double cream, heavy cream, fairly thick, fairly glossy. Give it a good whisk up. No seasoning at this stage. The salt does weird things to the batter. I recommend you have a look at this video by Ben Goshawk, which has great techniques dotted throughout for Yorkshires. But again, I'm adapting one I found in Heston Is This a Cookbook? So for your Yorkshires, in a hot oven about 200 degrees C, grease lightly, don't over grease because the grease can combine with the Yorkshire batter and turn it quite greasy in the mouth. Get all these things very hot, rescue your Yorkshire batter from the fridge, add a little seasoning to it, pop that into the heated oil in the baking tray, I use a muffin tin, and allow to cook for 20 to 30 minutes until risen and golden. If you find that they're completely risen, you may want to knock the heat down to 160 just to finish cooking them throughout so they're not all eggy at the bottom. And now our garnishes. When it comes to our carrots, you can check out his recipe for In Search of Perfection, where he does roast chicken and he serves carrots alongside. Fairly simple, but a perfect technique. Slice into diagonal chunks and then simmer in butter and thyme for about 30 minutes, keeping a lid on. No water involved. Heston posits that as the carrot cooks, the cell walls rupture and leaches out carrot flavour into the dish. If you're keeping it all in the same pan, it's not lost in that water that you'll eventually chuck down the sink. I'm also going to prepare some shallots. He doesn't give us a lot of guidance there, so I'm going to go with his old pal Marco Pierre White.
Man cannot live on potatoes alone.
Wrapping some shallot oil with butter, thyme and bay and salt, and just roast them for 30 minutes. Very, very simple. Radishes, just going to quickly halve, scorch in a pan, add water and cover to steam. After they start to go tender, just throwing in some sliced green beans for 2 to 3 minutes and just tossing with a little salt and butter just to coat. With the red wine sauce, I'm going to use what's in the pan for our beef and start to deglaze it with a generous slug of red wine. I actually regretted using this tray on my hob. It doesn't balance very well, so I transferred it to another pan at this point. I'm then going to add some beef stock and let it reduce down until thick and syrupy before checking for seasoning and whisking in some butter just to make it glossy and thicken slightly. And his final garnish there is bone marrow. So I've got a slice of bone marrow and I've just got some breadcrumbs mixed with parsley, which I've bashed together, and I'm just blowtorching just to char. As everything else is nearly ready, it's time to carve the beef. So let's slice it up there, and we've got it lovely and blushing pink in the side. A few slightly fatty bits that I'm going to trim up there and add into my sauce. So I think we are ready to plate up Heston Blumenthal's ultimate roast beef dinner. Let's start with the potatoes because they don't go cold very quickly. Got a lovely selection there of crunchy and soft potatoes, some roasted shallots, green bean and radish, carrots, confit in butter, and finished with caraway salt, our bone marrow slice, a proud Yorkshire pudding, and of course some lovely roast beef. And of course we top that with some of our red wine sauce, which has been sitting in some of the beef trimmings. So a couple of changes. Heston says he would have his with a Chateauneuf de Pop some year or other. My budget doesn't stretch to that, so just a bog standard glass of red wine, which is very nice. He also says he would have Mint Royale song playing in the background, which I would love to have, but the gods of YouTube won't let me do that, so let's tuck in. The beef is tender and yielding, and when you chew it, you get all the lovely beef flavour. Potatoes, I already know, will be excellent. Lovely crisp, but soft Yorkshire. It's all delicious. It's very nearly a traditional roast dinner. Of course, beef, Yorkshire pudding, potatoes, and then some vegetables. A few twists. I wouldn't consider them like Heston bonkers, but I think most people would go, oh, that's not what I'm doing for Sunday dinner today. And I think what it really shows you is, you know, if you had to ask people to guess, what would Heston Blumenthal have as his final meal? He would say, you know, an espuma of snail guts garnished with a cone waffle made out of sugar that actually looks like an Eskimo. I don't know, something like that, you know, those sort of bonkers things he's known for. But actually, when you ask him what he wants to eat, it's something simple. A roast dinner, which as someone growing up an Englishman, I can totally sympathise that he would want a very simple roast dinner. And it's a really good one too. I particularly like the carrots. I have made them like that a long time ago and I'd forgotten how good they are. Just make sure you put a lid on them, steam them in butter and thyme. Perfect. The caraway salt providing some acidity. It's a typically genius plate of food. Well, I hope you enjoyed that. If you did and you know someone else who would, click the share button down below and send it along to them and see what they would think too. And I'll catch you next time. And those carrots in caraway salt. Right, get down.